There was a night a few years back that I went with a friend to have a few drinks at an outdoor beer garden, which was part of an old colonial plaza. We watched the locals stroll around an enormous fountain at the plaza's center. The fountain was bone dry. Obviously, it was being repaired or possibly cleaned. I turned to my friend and I said, "It's a shame the fountain isn't working." I added, "Debería estar agua en ese fuente." My friend looked at me a bit confused and said, "It's not estar, it's haber." I considered this for a moment and realized that the use of haber wasn't as easy as I thought at first. I never really gave it that much consideration. I always thought of it as something fairly basic that you learn at the very beginning of your Spanish-speaking journey. But this one sentence made me reevaluate that notion. Haber is much trickier than I first perceived it to be. In my sentence about the fountain, two things were happening that led me to choose the wrong verb. The first was confusing existence with location. The second was not recognizing haber in the sentence because there was a word coming between there and be in my English translation. That is, there should be water in that fountain. Haber seems to be activated in the English brain in a very specific pattern or shape. That is, the word there and be situated next to each other in the sentence. Once there is a break with this, as in there should be, there could be, there has to be, the English brain wants to move away from the use of haber and towards the use of either ser or estar. This can cause many problems in our translations. So let's first look at this subtle difference between haber and ser and estar by thinking about the difference between existence and being, or a state of being. In English, there should be water in that fountain, and the water should be in that fountain feel basically like the same sentence. English speakers don't experience a semantic shift here. It seems as if it's the same situation, only phrased differently. But in Spanish, they are not the same, and that is the dilemma for English speakers. Spanish makes you choose between existence and location. Imagine you and I are looking at a map. I point and say, "There should be a park here." Every impulse in your English-speaking brain wants you to choose the verb estar. Are we not talking about location? And one of the most common triggers for the use of estar is location. But be careful. The use of haber signals the existence or presence of something without pointing to a specific already known item. Let's illustrate this by returning to the sentence earlier in the video. Debería haber agua en ese fuente. Let's contrast this with el agua debería estar en el fuente. What is the difference? The sentence with estar is expressing a specific identified thing that you've already mentioned. So in this case, you can take that thing and place it somewhere or locate it somewhere with the verb estar. In my original sentence with haber, agua is mentioned only after the verb. You're not taking the water and placing it somewhere. In the sentence with haber, you're talking about something that is missing, that doesn't exist. In this sentence, you are introducing the idea that in that place, water would make sense. And you're doing the same thing in the sentence, debería haber un parque allí. In that place, a park would make sense. This is such a subtle but immensely important difference between haber and estar. And in the sentence about the park, no park has been mentioned before. The listener doesn't have a specific park in mind. I'm not locating a real mentioned object. Contrast this with Parque Calderón debería estar aquí en el mapa. We now have a specific park in mind, and I'm taking that park and trying to locate it or place it on the map. A good rule of thumb is that if you can replace the verb be or is or was with the verb exist in your Spanish, you're probably going to use haber. Let's look at another example. Va a llegar un momento en el que solo va a haber turistas aquí. The moment is going to arrive in which there are only going to be tourists here. Again, my mind wants to go straight to estar and not haber here, because I think about how I might say people are there. La gente está allí. But again, it's a question of existence versus location. And look where haber is situated in the sentence. I haven't mentioned the tourists yet. I'm not taking the tourists and placing them in a location. Now let's focus on another obstacle that perplexes the native English-speaking learner of Spanish when it comes to correctly choosing haber. This has to do with the mental block that exists when a word comes between the word there and the verb be in your English sentence you're trying to translate. We see this in the example I used at the beginning of the video. Debería haber agua en esa fuente. The English translation being, there should be water in that fountain. Something as simple as a word coming between there and be in our English sentence can throw off the Spanish learner with regards to using haber. And once this pattern diverges from our familiar pattern, the association doesn't activate for us. The Spanish learner recognizes haber in this very specific English template. We learn it as tied to a particular formula. There is. When that shape changes, another habit takes over. The English brain only activates haber in this specific shape, and in other situations it defaults to ser or estar. So let's take a look at some of these examples. Let's start with a could-be construction. Here we have the poder haber construction. Podría haber más gente en el restaurante que yo creía. I bet the majority of learners' first reaction to this sentence would be to use estar. Podría estar más gente aquí que yo creía. There should be a doctor in the building. Debería haber un doctor en el edificio. How about, to make more money in her store, there has to be more people in the area. Here we have a there has to be construction that makes me want to use the typical tiene que ser construction. But again, I would be wrong. It's tiene que haber. Para ganar dinero en su tienda, tiene que haber más gente en la zona. Continuing on this idea of an unfamiliar pattern or an unfamiliar shape when constructing a sentence with haber, we can see the same thing happening in perfect tenses. It would seem natural that the have or had been pattern would be the auxiliary plus ser or estar in the past participle. But again, the two issues from earlier are present in this construction as well. It is an existence versus state or being question, as well as being difficult for the English brain because of the break away from the familiar pattern or shape of there is, there are, there was, there were. For many native English-speaking learners of Spanish, when it comes to perfect tenses, haber never enters the conversation. Look at the sentence, ha habido problemas. One's first instinct is, ha sido problemas. But again, we're talking about the existence or non-existence of problems. How about the sentence, there had been many storms there? My first instinct would be to use estar. Había estado tantas tormentas allí. I'm thinking the location of the storms there, but that would be wrong. I'm talking about the existence of storms there. We can contrast this with the storms had been there in the past. In this case, I can use estar. Las tormentas habían estado allí en el pasado. I'm taking the storms that we mentioned and placing them in a location. Now let's look at haber being used in a slightly more complex grammatical structure, the modal perfect. Try to translate this sentence. There must have been people there. It's debe haber habido gente allí. I know my first instinct was to think, debe haber estado gente allí. Was that your first instinct as well? I'm thinking about people being in a place, and my mind immediately goes to estar, but that would be wrong. So to conclude, we need to become more familiar with the verb haber if we want to take our Spanish to the next level. This takes an awareness of the subtle differences between haber and ser and estar, a difference that's rooted in the contrast between existence and being. The other challenge for us is when haber moves beyond the familiar pattern or shape of there situated next to the verb be in our English translations. The easy to construct hay, había, and hubo as there is, there are, there was, there were becomes much more challenging when there's a word between there and be in our English translations, and even more challenging in more complex grammatical constructions like perfect tenses or the modal perfect. In these structures, it can be especially difficult to understand how haber is being utilized. I hope this video has given you a new lens through which to see how haber is being used in these more complex constructions, as well as showing how the verb haber can be much more challenging than many learners of Spanish realize. Thanks for watching.